6 minutes. That's how long I had been standing in the parking garage holding a box of my own belongings before my husband's name lit up my phone screen. I didn't answer. I had built the financial backbone of Hartwell and Cross Hospitality from a spreadsheet and a dream. 12 years, 4 restaurant concepts, 31 locations across 8 states, and now I was standing next to a concrete pillar on level 2 of our own corporate headquarters, holding a banker's box that contained a framed photo of my kids, a coffee mug that said Boss Lady, a joke gift from our accountant, and the original lease agreements I'd negotiated myself for our first 3 properties. My husband had handed me that box personally, in front of the entire executive team. He smiled when he did it. That's what I keep coming back to, not the words, the smile. "We're restructuring," he said. "Your position is being eliminated." He didn't even look me in the eye when he said it. He looked just past my shoulder toward the conference room windows where I could see her reflection. Noelle, our new Chief Experience Officer. A title he'd invented 3 weeks ago, a title that hadn't existed until he needed a reason to bring her in. I had known about them for 47 days. I know the exact number because I'd started writing it down. Not out of obsession, out of habit. I'm a CFO, I document everything, and that habit was about to save me. I didn't start in restaurants, I started in commercial real estate, which is how I met my husband in the first place. He was charming, ambitious, and completely hopeless with numbers. He had vision, I had execution. We married young. I was 29, he was 34, and within a year we'd pooled everything we had and signed the lease on a 2,400 square foot space in Nashville that would become our first location. The name was my idea. The logo was his. The vendor contracts, the equipment financing, the health department certifications, the POS system integrations, the POS integration, all mine. That was how it worked between us. He shook hands. I made sure the hands had something real to shake on. By year 4, we had 6 locations and had been featured in 2 regional business magazines. By year 8, we had private equity interest. By year 10, we were operating 31 restaurants under 4 distinct brand concepts. And I had built a financial infrastructure that our investors called unusually sophisticated for an operator of this size. My husband called it Audrey being Audrey. He said it like it was a term of endearment. I used to think it was. The first time I noticed something was wrong was a Tuesday in February. He came home late. Not unusual, but he'd showered before coming in, and the story he gave me about a vendor dinner in Brentwood didn't match the credit card statement I reviewed the next morning for routine expense tracking. The charge was at a restaurant in East Nashville, a place we'd scouted for potential acquisition 2 years earlier and passed on. I didn't say anything. I went back to my desk and I opened a new document. I titled the DAT, the discrepancy, and moved on because that is who I am. I don't react. I document. Over the next 6 weeks, I documented 47 things. What most people don't understand about being a CFO, especially a CFO who is also a co-founder and wife, is that you have access to everything, not just the bank accounts and the tax filings. Everything. The vendor relationships, the lease structures, the licensing agreements, the insurance policies, the franchise disclosure documents, and more importantly, the names on all of it. When we had restructured the company 3 years earlier as part of a refinancing deal, I had flagged something to our attorney. Several of our key supplier agreements, the produce distributors, the linen service, the proprietary spice blend manufacturer for our most profitable concept, were structured in a way that tied them to the operating entity. If that entity changed ownership structure or lost its CFO without a formal transition agreement, the contracts contained a clause that required renegotiation from scratch. My husband had nodded through that meeting like he understood. He didn't ask a single question. Our attorney had looked at me afterward and said, "You might want to make sure those are updated if anything ever changes in the leadership structure." I smiled and said, "I'll take care of it." I did not take care of it. I want to be honest about that. I didn't leave those contracts alone out of some master plan. At the time, it was just bureaucratic procrastination, but when February turned into March, and March turned into the 47th entry in my observations document, I went back and read that clause very carefully. And then I read it again. And then I called my attorney. Not the one who handled company matters, but my personal attorney, a woman named Patricia, who I'd used once before for a real estate dispute. And I told her I needed a consultation, personal capacity, not company business. Patricia listened for 40 minutes without interrupting. Then she said, "Don't touch anything. Don't restructure anything. And don't tell him what you know." I said, "I know." She said, "Audrey, I mean it. Don't move a single document." I said, "I haven't moved anything in 6 weeks." There was a pause. Then she said, "Good girl." He fired me on a Thursday morning in April, 11 days after I'd filed for divorce through Patricia. He didn't know about the filing yet. It hadn't been served, which means he thought he was getting ahead of something. Thought he was protecting whatever settlement he imagined he'd negotiate by eliminating my role in the company first. What he'd actually done was trigger every single one of those supplier clauses. The moment I was no longer CFO of Hartwell and Cross Hospitality, the renegotiation windows opened. 30 days for the produce network, 60 days for the equipment service agreements, 90 days for the proprietary blend manufacturer, the one that supplied the spice formula for our highest margin concept, the one that had been profiled in Food and Wine 2 years ago and accounted for nearly 40% of our total revenue across all brands. I knew the timelines, he did not. I walked out of that parking garage with my banker's box and I called Patricia from my car. She already knew. I had texted her a single word when I left the building. "Done," she said. "Clock's running." I said, "I know." I drove home. I fed the dog. I sat at my kitchen table and I opened my laptop and I started making calls. The next 2 months were the strangest of my life. I was simultaneously grieving and building. I cried in the mornings, usually in the shower where my kids couldn't hear me. My daughter was 16 and old enough to understand more than I let her. My son was 13 and angry in the unfocused way 13-year-old boys get when something is wrong, and nobody will tell them exactly what it is. I told them the company was going through changes. I told them their dad and I were working through some things. I told them to keep going to school and keep doing their activities, and that I would explain some more when I could. Then I would close their bedroom doors and go back to my kitchen table. I had been doing consulting work informally for years. Other restaurateurs would call me advice on lease structures or financing strategies, and I'd help them as a courtesy. In the 2 months after I was fired, I formalized that. I reached out to 6 operators I'd mentored over the years, offered a structured advisory arrangement, and within 3 weeks had enough revenue coming in to cover my personal expenses comfortably. That part surprised me, how fast it came together, how many people said yes. One of them, a woman who owned 4 breakfast concepts in the Atlanta market, said, "I've been waiting for you to go independent for years. I always thought you were too good to stay in one place." I didn't know what to say to that. I thanked her. After I hung up the phone, I sat very still for a few minutes. I thought about how long I had believed that staying in one place was the same as being loyal. How long I had confused those two things. Meanwhile, Hartwell and Cross was unraveling in ways that were quietly spectacular. I was not watching vindictively. I was watching because I needed to understand the timing. Patricia had been very clear. There was a window, and we needed to know exactly when to move. The produce supplier sent their renegotiation notice in week 3. My husband's new operations team, he had promoted 2 people I'd never trusted and brought in a third from outside who had a flashy resume and no actual multi-unit experience, didn't respond within the notice window. I know this because one of our longtime delivery drivers texted me to ask if everything was okay at the corporate office. He said the invoices had stopped being paid on schedule. I thanked him. I noted the date. The proprietary blend manufacturer sent their notice in week 7. This one was more serious because of what it meant for the flagship concept. Without that formula, and our agreement included an exclusivity clause that prevented them from selling it to any other operator during our contract period, They couldn't replicate the product internally. They didn't have a culinary R&D team. They had a spreadsheet and a supplier relationship. Both were mine. I had a coffee with the manufacturer's owner in week 9. C2. He was a quiet man in his 60s who'd been supplying us since year 2. He said, "I didn't want to call you. I felt like I was going behind someone's back." I said, "You're not going behind anyone's back. You're exercising your contractual rights." He looked uncomfortable. He said, "Your husband sent someone to meet with us." A young woman, very enthusiastic. I said, "What did she offer?" He named a number. It was significantly below what I had negotiated in the original contract. It was also, frankly, insulting given the volume we had been doing with him. I said, "I'd like to make you a counter-proposal." He said, "I was hoping you would." The divorce proceedings had been moving in parallel. My husband had been served in week 2. He had retained an attorney and made what Patricia described as the classic mistake of confusing marital assets with family assets. He believed the company was his. He believed this sincerely, which tells you something about the story he'd been telling himself for 12 years. That his vision had built it, that his handshakes had built it, that the fact that his name appeared first on the masthead meant something definitive about ownership. What he had forgotten, or perhaps never truly understood, was that when we incorporated, we had done so as equal partners. 50-50. Whatever he'd told Noelle, whatever story he'd constructed to explain to her why he could simply hand her a title and restructure the leadership team, the actual documents told a different story. Patricia filed a motion to freeze company asset transfers in week 4. The judge granted a temporary order. My husband called me for the first time since he'd fired me. It was 10:30 at night. I let it go to voicemail. He left a message that was 3 minutes and 40 seconds long. I listened to it once, noted the timestamp, and forwarded it to Patricia. The call I'd been waiting for came on a Friday morning in late June. It wasn't from my husband. It was from the private equity partner who had been with us since our Series A round. A man named Barrett, who I had personally walked through every due diligence document across 2 fundraising cycles, who knew our cap table and our unit economics better than anyone outside the company. He said, "Audrey, I'm going to skip the pleasantries. We have a problem." I said, "I know." He said, "Your flagship concept cannot operate without that supply agreement. We've been trying to find an alternative source for 6 weeks and there is no comparable product on the market. 2 of your top-performing locations have had to modify their menus, and we've seen a 17% drop in comp sales at those units in 4 weeks." I said, "I know." He said, "We need you back." I was quiet for a moment, not for effect. I genuinely needed a second. Then I said, "I need you to understand something, Barrett. I was terminated without cause by the co-owner of this company, who used his position to install a personal relationship in a manufactured executive role while simultaneously attempting to negotiate an inequitable divorce settlement. I did not leave. I was removed." He said, "I understand that." I said, "I don't think you fully do. Because what you're asking me to do is return to a company where my equity position, my professional contributions, and my judgment were all dismissed simultaneously. And I need to know what's being offered before this conversation goes any further." There was a long pause. He said, "What do you need?" And that was the moment. That was the one I'd been building towards since February, since the first discrepancy on the credit card statement, since I'd sat down and opened a document and titled it Observations. I had a list. Of course I had a list. I'm a CFO. I always have a list. The terms I brought to the table were not punitive. I was not interested in punishment. I was interested in structure. Sustainable, documented, enforceable structure. I would return as sole CFO with an expanded mandate that included operational oversight of all financial partnerships and supplier relationships. My husband would retain his title as CEO with a clearly defined scope, brand strategy, external partnership growth planning, and an explicitly defined list of decisions that required my countersignature. My equity position would be rebalanced net to 51%, not out of spite, because it was accurate. Because the financial infrastructure of the company was my work, and its collapse in my absence had demonstrated that in terms that required no further argument. Noelle would be transitioned out of her role within 60 days with a standard severance package and no further claim on company equity or intellectual property, and my attorney would have final review rights on any executive personnel changes going forward. Barrett sent the term sheet to my husband on a Monday. I know what happened in that room because Barrett told me later. My husband read it once, set it down, and said, "She planned this." Barrett said, "I don't think that's the relevant question right now." My husband said, "She knew. She knew about the contracts." Barrett said, "Sign the term sheet." I walked back into Hartwell and Cross on a Tuesday morning in July. I wore the same suit I'd worn the day I'd been escorted out. Not as a statement, it was just a good suit and I'd missed wearing it. My assistant, who had sent me a text that simply said, "We're ready," the night before, had already restocked my office, same desk, different plant, because the old one had apparently died in my absence, which felt like a metaphor I wasn't going to spend too much energy on. I called a full team meeting for 9 a.m. No agenda sent in advance. I had learned over the years that the best way to reset a room is to walk in and simply begin. I said good morning. I thanked people for their patience. I told them we were going to spend the next 30 days doing a full operational review, and that I expected everyone's cooperation and honesty, and that anyone who gave me both would have nothing to worry about. I did not mention my husband. I did not mention Noelle. I did not mention the divorce, which was proceeding separately and would continue to proceed separately. Because my marriage and my company had always been two different things, even when my husband had convinced himself otherwise. At the end of the meeting, one of our regional managers, a woman who had been with us for 9 years, who had helped us open our 12th location and our 20th and our 28th, raised her hand and said, "Are you back for good?" I said, "I'm back." She started to applaud, and then the room followed. I didn't cry. I had done my crying in the shower at 6th morning for 2 months, and I was finished with that chapter. The divorce finalized 7 months later. My husband and I divided the personal assets cleanly. The company remained intact, operating under the restructured agreement. He retained his title and his 49% and attended board meetings with what I can only describe as a punctual and muted professionalism that bore almost no resemblance to the man I'd married. Noelle was gone before August. I don't know where she went, and I don't follow up on things that are no longer my concern. My daughter asked me once, about 6 months after everything settled, what I had been thinking the morning I was fired, whether I had been scared. I thought about it honestly before I answered. I told her I was scared for about 12 minutes, the time it took to get from the parking garage to the highway on-ramp. And then I remembered the contracts. And then I was not scared anymore. She thought about that for a moment. Then she said, "So you had a plan?" I said, "I had documentation. The plan came from the documentation." She nodded like she was filing that away somewhere. She's 17 now. She wants to study finance. I told her it was a good field. I told her the most important thing you can learn is that power is not loud. Power is precise. Power is the thing you put in writing on a Tuesday afternoon in a lawyer's office that nobody pays attention to until the moment it matters completely. She asked me what I would do differently if I could go back. I said I wouldn't go back. Not because it wasn't hard, because everything I built the second time around I built with my eyes fully open. The supplier network I renegotiated. The board oversight structure I redesigned. The management team I spent 18 months carefully assembling, people I chose for what they could actually do, not for how they made me feel included. The company that exists today is cleaner than the one I ran before. It is more sustainable, more legible, and more mine in the ways that actually matter, and every contract has my name on it. Not first because of ego. First because I earned it. First because I built it. And now, first because the paperwork says so, and nobody will ever be confused about that again.